The easiest way to spot fake authority is to politely ask where it came from. The first sound I heard that morning was not the wind rolling across my pasture or the distant call of cattle gathering near the east fence. It was the sharp crunch of expensive sport utility vehicles climbing my gravel driveway in a line that looked more like a parade than a neighborhood meeting. Cold autumn air carried the scent of fresh hay, cedar posts, and damp earth, while the early sunlight painted long shadows across the front porch of the ranch house my family had lived in for more than a century. I set my coffee mug on the railing and watched 6 members of the Homeowners Association board step out wearing matching expressions of absolute confidence. At the center of them stood Linda Mercer, president of the Homeowners Association, holding a thick envelope as if it contained the final word on my future. Several board members already had their phones raised, recording everything before anyone had spoken a single sentence. Linda smiled, the kind of practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Nathan Caldwell," she announced loudly enough for every camera to capture her voice. "You have officially been removed from this property. You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon to vacate the ranch." She extended the envelope toward me with both hands, almost ceremonially, waiting for the dramatic reaction she clearly expected. Instead, I accepted the papers, unfolded them carefully, and read every page, while the only sounds around us were the gentle creaking of the old windmill and the distant rustle of cottonwood leaves. The documents called themselves an eviction notice issued by the Homeowners Association. They cited community bylaws, board authority, and alleged violations that supposedly gave them the power to remove me from land my great-grandfather purchased decades before the subdivision even existed. I looked up from the pages and asked one simple question. Who told you that your board has the authority to evict a property owner from privately deeded land outside your governing boundaries? Linda laughed softly before answering. Our attorney reviewed everything. We know exactly what we are doing. Several homeowners standing behind the board nodded in agreement while continuing to record the moment. I noticed nervous faces mixed among the confident ones, neighbors who looked less interested in celebrating than in watching whatever happened next. Before I could respond, another vehicle turned onto the gravel road leading toward the ranch. Then another. The familiar green and gold markings of the sheriff's office became visible through the morning dust. One patrol truck was followed by a second. The board members exchanged satisfied smiles, convinced the deputies had arrived to enforce the papers resting in my hands. Linda folded her arms confidently and whispered to one of the board members, loud enough for me to hear, "This will be over in a few minutes." I never moved from the porch. I simply folded the notice, slipped it back into the envelope, and rested one hand against the weathered cedar post my grandfather installed with his own hands 40 years earlier. The deputies parked quietly near the barn instead of blocking my driveway. They stepped out without urgency, scanning the gathering with calm expressions that revealed nothing. Watching them approach across the pasture, I realized something the board had completely overlooked. They believed authority came from printing official-looking documents. I knew authority began with the truth, and the truth had been waiting on this ranch far longer than any homeowners association. The deputies stopped a respectful distance from the porch instead of walking directly toward me, and that single decision seemed to confuse the Homeowners Association board more than anything else that morning. The ranch was unusually quiet except for the steady creak of the old windmill and the low sound of cattle grazing beyond the split-rail fence. Cool air carried the familiar scent of fresh alfalfa, worn saddle leather, and pine drifting down from the hills surrounding the valley. I could feel every set of eyes fixed on me as I tucked the so-called eviction notice beneath my arm, without showing the slightest sign of concern. One deputy greeted me by name before asking whether this was the property referenced in a complaint they had received earlier that morning. I nodded and answered honestly, "Yes, deputy. This ranch has belonged to my family for 112 years. Linda immediately stepped forward, holding a binder thick with Homeowners Association documents. She explained with absolute confidence that I had repeatedly violated community regulations, refused to comply with board directives, and had therefore been lawfully removed from the property. Her voice sounded polished, almost rehearsed, as though she had practiced every sentence before arriving. The deputy listened politely without interrupting, then asked a simple question that changed the atmosphere almost immediately. Does your association actually have jurisdiction over this ranch? Linda answered before anyone else could speak. Of course we do. It has always been part of our community. The deputy looked toward me. I walked inside the ranch house for less than a minute before returning with a weathered leather portfolio my father had carried long before I inherited the property. Inside were certified deeds, county survey maps, tax records, and the original subdivision filings recorded decades earlier. I laid them carefully across the porch table while the morning breeze lifted the corners of the yellowed survey maps. Every document told exactly the same story. The subdivision ended more than half a mile before my front gate. My ranch had never been annexed into the homeowners association, never accepted its governing documents, and never granted the board authority over any portion of the property. The deputy studied the county plat for several quiet moments before comparing parcel numbers with information displayed on the computer inside his patrol vehicle. Linda continued insisting that the association had enforced rules against previous owners for years, but the records showed something very different. My late father had politely ignored every unofficial notice they had mailed because none of them carried legal authority beyond the subdivision entrance. As I watched the deputy verify each parcel number, memories of my father came flooding back. He always told me to keep every letter, every survey, every receipt, and every conversation involving the ranch because paper has a remarkable way of remembering the truth long after people forget it. That habit had filled filing cabinets inside the old ranch office over 4 generations. The deputy eventually returned from his patrol truck carrying a printed county parcel map. He placed it beside my documents and quietly confirmed that every official record matched perfectly. My property stood completely outside the homeowners association boundaries. Around us, the confident expressions that had filled the driveway only minutes earlier slowly began giving way to uncertainty. Some neighbors lowered their phones while others quietly exchanged confused glances. Linda remained determined, insisting there had to be another document proving the board's authority. Listening to her repeat those words, I realized this morning was never really about forcing me off my land. It was about discovering how long confidence could survive once it finally met verified facts. The deputies thanked me for the records, made copies of several documents, and quietly left the ranch without issuing a single order to anyone. As their patrol trucks disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees, the homeowners association board stood frozen in my driveway. Unsure how a morning they expected to end with my departure had instead ended with questions about their own authority. Linda gathered the papers she had confidently presented only an hour earlier, but her expression had changed. The certainty that carried her onto my porch had been replaced by visible frustration. Before leaving, she looked directly at me and said, "This is not over." I simply nodded. I never thought it was. The following weeks became the busiest I had experienced since inheriting the ranch. Almost every few days another envelope arrived in my mailbox bearing the Homeowners Association logo. One letter claimed my fencing violated neighborhood standards. Another demanded I repaint my barn in an approved exterior color that did not even exist when my grandfather built it. A third notice attempted to fine me for livestock visible from subdivision roads. Every accusation ignored the same simple fact the county records had already confirmed. My ranch was not subject to the association's governing documents. Still, I refused to throw any of the notices away. Each envelope was opened carefully, scanned into my computer, dated, and filed inside a cabinet my father had labeled property records years earlier. The cabinet smelled faintly of cedar and aging paper every time I pulled open one of its heavy drawers. My father always believed documentation was cheaper than arguments, and I had learned long ago that patience often uncovered more than confrontation ever could. The harassment gradually became more organized. Board members drove slowly past the ranch entrance, taking photographs from the public road. Volunteers measured the height of my entrance sign using tape measures. Someone even mailed anonymous complaints to county offices claiming I was operating commercial activities without permits, despite the ranch having held the same agricultural classification for generations. Each complaint required a brief county inspection, and each inspection ended exactly the same way. Officials reviewed the records, confirmed everything complied with existing regulations, thanked me for my time, and closed the file. After the 4th inspection, one county employee quietly smiled while climbing back into his truck and said, "Mr. Caldwell, somebody is spending an awful lot of energy trying to create a problem that does not seem to exist." I smiled politely, but said nothing. Late one afternoon, while repairing a section of fence near the western pasture, I noticed an older pickup truck stop beside the county road. A gray-haired woman stepped out, looked around carefully, and walked toward the gate carrying a small cardboard box. She introduced herself as Eleanor Briggs, a former homeowners association secretary who had resigned several years earlier. Her voice remained soft, but her eyes carried the look of someone who had spent a long time deciding whether to speak. She placed the box on the tailgate of my truck and quietly explained that she could no longer watch the board misuse its authority without telling someone what she knew. Inside the box were old meeting minutes, handwritten notes, printed emails, financial reports, and several portable storage drives carefully labeled by date. I looked up, surprised by what sat in front of me. Eleanor took one slow breath before saying the sentence that changed everything. "You are not the first person they tried to force off land they never had the authority to control, but you might be the first one with enough records to prove exactly how they have been doing it." That evening, I carried Eleanor's cardboard box into the old ranch office, where 4 generations of my family's records lined cedar shelves from floor to ceiling. The room smelled of aged paper, leather bindings, coffee, and the faint scent of pine drifting through the open window. Rain tapped softly against the glass while a brass desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across my grandfather's scarred oak desk. I carefully removed every folder from the box one at a time, arranging them beside my own records instead of mixing them together. Years of engineering work had taught me that evidence only matters when its history remains clear. The first folder contained homeowners association meeting minutes that had never been distributed to residents. The second held printed email conversations between board members discussing ways to pressure property owners into selling land adjacent to the subdivision. Another folder contained spreadsheets showing legal expenses charged to the association for disputes that board members publicly claimed had never existed. None of those documents alone proved wrongdoing, but together they revealed a pattern that matched every notice I had received during the previous several months. Then I opened one of the portable storage drives Eleanor had labeled simply board meetings. Inside were archived recordings of virtual meetings saved over several years. I listened quietly through headphones while rain continued falling outside the ranch house. At first, the conversations sounded routine, discussing landscaping contracts, road maintenance, and annual budgets. Then one recording changed everything. A board member asked whether the association actually had legal authority over my ranch. The room fell silent for several seconds before Linda answered calmly that jurisdiction was less important than persistence. She explained that if enough violation notices, legal threats, and financial pressure were applied, most owners eventually gave up because fighting became too expensive. Another board member asked what would happen if county records proved the ranch remained outside the subdivision boundaries. Linda responded that very few residents ever verified property records themselves, and perception often became stronger than documentation if repeated long enough. I removed the headphones and stared across the quiet office. The rain had stopped, replaced by the distant sound of frogs near the lower pasture. My grandfather's notebook rested beside the computer exactly where I had left it that morning. For years he had written the same sentence across the first page of every annual journal. Truth survives because records survive. Sitting there beneath the soft glow of the desk lamp, I finally understood why he documented everything so carefully. The next morning I contacted my attorney and invited Eleanor to meet us at the ranch. We spent nearly 6 hours reviewing every email, financial report, meeting minute, recording, and county document together. My attorney never rushed to conclusions. Instead, he organized everything into chronological order, comparing association actions against official property records and applicable state law. By late afternoon, the conference table had disappeared beneath carefully labeled binders, certified plats, printed transcripts, and highlighted timelines connecting one decision to the next. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and quietly closed the final folder. "Nathan," he said, "this is no longer about a disagreement over property boundaries. If these records are authentic, they may show a deliberate pattern of misrepresenting authority and using official board actions beyond the limits established by law. As evening settled across the ranch and the last sunlight faded beyond the western hills, I looked out toward the quiet pasture where everything had begun. For the first time since the board appeared with that envelope on my porch, I realized the investigation was no longer centered on me. It had quietly begun turning toward the people who believed nobody would ever read the records they left behind. Over the next 2 weeks, my attorney transformed hundreds of scattered pages into a timeline that was impossible to ignore. Every homeowners association notice, every certified county record, every archived email, every board meeting transcript, and every complaint filed against my ranch was arranged in exact chronological order across a conference table inside his office. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee, printer paper, and polished wood while late afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting narrow lines across stacks of carefully labeled binders. Looking at the complete sequence for the first time felt very different from reading individual documents. Instead of isolated disagreements, a consistent pattern emerged. Every time the board discovered my ranch remained outside its jurisdiction, another violation notice appeared anyway. Every time county officials confirmed my property fell beyond the association boundaries, another demand letter arrived claiming authority that official records did not support. My attorney quietly pointed toward one section of the timeline, where several board emails lined up beside financial records. According to the documents, association funds had repeatedly been used to finance legal efforts targeting properties that were never part of the homeowners association. The meeting transcripts showed board members discussing those expenses while publicly describing them as ordinary administrative costs during annual meetings with residents. Eleanor carefully identified the voices on each recording, explaining who attended every meeting and which decisions had actually been approved by formal vote. The more we compared her recollections with the archived files, the more accurately everything matched. Nothing needed to be exaggerated because the records already spoke for themselves. Several days later, my attorney requested a formal meeting with investigators from the county authorities responsible for reviewing complaints involving public records and organizational governance. We arrived carrying 3 large storage boxes filled with certified documents, printed transcripts, financial reports, historical property records, and copies of the archived recordings. The investigators accepted everything without making promises or conclusions. Instead, they carefully logged every item into evidence, asking detailed questions about dates, document sources, and how each record had been preserved. I appreciated that approach because it reminded me of engineering. Reliable conclusions are built one verified measurement at a time. As we finished, one investigator paused while reviewing the timeline and quietly remarked that the organization of the evidence made it much easier to understand how each event connected to the next. Outside the government building, the autumn air felt cool and carried the scent of fallen leaves after an overnight rain. I drove back toward the ranch without any expectation of immediate results. Investigations do not move at the speed of frustration. They move at the speed of verification. During the following days, life on the ranch returned to its familiar rhythm. I repaired fencing, checked water tanks, fed livestock, and watched migrating geese cross the valley beneath bright blue skies. Yet something had undeniably changed. The violation notices stopped arriving. No board members drove slowly past the front gate taking photographs. No anonymous complaints reached county offices. Even the unusual silence felt meaningful because it suggested the story had quietly moved beyond neighborhood arguments and into the hands of people whose responsibility was simply to determine whether the evidence supported the facts. Standing on the porch one cool evening while the setting sun reflected across the western pasture, I realized my father had been right all those years ago. Patience does not always feel like progress, but sometimes it is the strongest evidence that the truth has finally found the right audience. 3 weeks passed before my attorney called just after sunrise. I was repairing a water trough near the north pasture when my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. Frost still covered the grass, and the air carried the familiar scent of pine, damp soil, and fresh hay while a thin layer of mist drifted across the creek behind the barn. My attorney rarely called that early unless something important had happened. His voice remained calm, but I immediately recognized the quiet confidence behind every word. He explained that county investigators had completed the initial review of the evidence and believed the documentation justified expanding the inquiry. The meeting transcripts, financial records, archived emails, certified property maps, and recorded board discussions all aligned with one another in ways that required further investigation. He emphasized that no conclusions had been reached yet, only that the evidence deserved a formal legal process. That was all I needed to hear. The truth was finally moving through the proper channels instead of being buried beneath neighborhood rumors. Life at the ranch continued much the same. I repaired fences, rotated cattle between pastures, and winterized irrigation lines before the first hard freeze arrived. The quiet rhythm of ordinary work became strangely comforting after months of constant letters and accusations. Then something unusual happened. Residents from the subdivision began stopping by the ranch, not to argue, but to ask questions. Some carried copies of association newsletters. Others brought meeting agendas or notices they had received over the years. Several admitted they had never realized my ranch stood completely outside the homeowners association. One older couple apologized for believing the stories they had heard about me refusing to cooperate with the community. I invited them onto the porch, poured fresh coffee, and showed them the same county maps I had shared with the deputies months earlier. Nobody left angry. Most left surprised. One afternoon, Eleanor returned carrying another folder she had recently discovered while cleaning storage boxes in her garage. Inside were several original board resolutions from years earlier. One unsigned draft immediately caught my attorney's attention because it proposed extending association enforcement beyond the recorded subdivision boundaries, even though handwritten notes in the margin questioned whether such authority legally existed. Another page referenced concerns raised by previous board members about potential liability if those actions continued. Reading those documents felt like watching missing pieces quietly fall into place. They did not replace the existing evidence. They explained why the pattern had continued despite repeated warnings. My attorney forwarded certified copies to the investigators together with an updated timeline reflecting the newly discovered records. Several days later, county officials requested additional interviews with former board members and residents who had firsthand knowledge of earlier decisions. The investigation was clearly growing larger than a single disagreement involving my ranch. Standing outside the barn that evening, I watched the last orange light disappear beyond the western hills while cattle settled quietly into the pasture for the night. The ranch felt exactly as it always had, steady, honest, and unchanged by the noise surrounding it. Yet somewhere beyond those hills, people were carefully comparing documents, asking difficult questions, and following evidence wherever it led. For months, the Homeowners Association board believed authority came from speaking with confidence. They were about to discover that real authority begins when verified facts are examined by people whose only job is to follow them to their logical conclusion, no matter where that path eventually ends. The first public sign that something had changed appeared on a cold Tuesday evening when the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association abruptly canceled its monthly board meeting without offering any explanation. Residents who had already gathered outside the clubhouse stood in small groups reading a printed notice taped to the front door while the parking lot slowly emptied beneath a gray winter sky. The following morning, I drove into town for livestock feed and noticed conversations stopping the moment I walked into the local supply store. Nobody looked angry anymore. They looked curious. Rumors had finally reached the community, but unlike the stories that had circulated about me months earlier, these were being driven by official requests for records instead of neighborhood gossip. The air smelled of fresh coffee, wood smoke, and cold mountain wind as I loaded feed bags into the back of my truck. An elderly rancher I had known for years quietly stepped beside me and said, "Word is the county has been asking a lot of questions about board finances." I simply thanked him for the information and finished securing the load. I had promised myself from the beginning that I would never try the case in public. Evidence belonged with investigators, not in parking lot conversations. 2 days later, my attorney called again. Investigators had completed another round of interviews with former board members, contractors, accountants, and residents. Several independent statements matched details already contained within the archived meeting recordings and financial records. Every additional interview strengthened the timeline instead of contradicting it. That consistency mattered more than dramatic accusations ever could. On Friday afternoon, I was repairing a section of fence near the southern pasture when two sheriff's office vehicles slowly entered my driveway. For a brief moment, I thought another complaint had somehow been filed, but the deputies stepped out with relaxed expressions and greeted me by name. They explained they were delivering a formal request asking whether I would be available the following week if investigators needed clarification regarding several historical property documents. I agreed immediately and invited them inside the ranch office. The familiar scent of cedar shelves, old paper, and fresh coffee filled the room as we reviewed copies of county plats, recorded deeds, historical surveys, and maintenance records that had remained unchanged for generations. One deputy paused while examining the timeline displayed across the conference table. He quietly remarked that very few investigations arrived with documentation this complete. Before leaving, he thanked me for preserving every record instead of reacting emotionally when the dispute first began. After their vehicles disappeared down the gravel road, I stood on the porch watching the winter sunlight fade across the pasture. The ranch felt peaceful in a way it had not for months. Meanwhile, inside the subdivision, another emergency homeowners association meeting had reportedly been scheduled behind closed doors. Several residents later told me board members entered carrying large storage boxes and left hours later looking noticeably shaken. No official announcements followed. No new violation notices appeared. No additional letters reached my mailbox. The silence itself had become the loudest development of all. Standing beside the old windmill as its blades turned slowly against the evening sky, I remembered something my grandfather once told me while repairing fences together. When people stop arguing and start gathering documents, he said, the truth is getting ready to introduce itself. Looking across the quiet valley that night, I realized his words were about to become more real than anyone on that homeowners association board had ever imagined. The following Thursday began like every other winter morning on the ranch. Frost covered the fence rails, the creek moved slowly beneath a thin layer of mist, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with cedar firewood drifting from the old stone chimney. I was feeding cattle near the eastern pasture when I noticed several sheriff's office vehicles driving past my entrance without turning toward the ranch. Instead, they continued down the county road toward the Cedar Ridge clubhouse. A few minutes later, another unmarked county vehicle followed behind them. I stood quietly beside the fence, watching their headlights disappear beyond the pine trees, feeling that familiar sense of patience my grandfather always carried whenever events finally began unfolding on their own. Less than an hour later, my attorney called. His voice remained measured, but there was no mistaking the significance of what he was about to tell me. Investigators had completed their review. A county judge had authorized additional legal actions based upon the accumulated evidence, and law enforcement officers were serving official court documents connected to the investigation. He reminded me not to speculate, not to celebrate, and not to discuss details publicly because the legal process still deserved the same respect we had shown from the beginning. I thanked him, ended the call, and returned to repairing a section of fence exactly where I had stopped. The truth did not require an audience. By early afternoon, the entire county seemed to know something important had happened. Local residents quietly gathered outside the subdivision entrance while news vehicles remained parked along the public road. Nobody blocked traffic. Nobody shouted. Everyone simply watched as officers entered and left the clubhouse carrying sealed evidence containers, labeled document boxes, and several office computers that had been authorized for examination through the investigation. The atmosphere felt remarkably calm despite the obvious seriousness of the moment. Several homeowners later told me they had been asked to provide records, meeting notices, financial statements, and correspondence they had saved over the years. Many willingly cooperated because they wanted clear answers just as much as anyone else. As evening approached, Eleanor visited the ranch once again. She stood beside the porch looking across the quiet pasture before speaking, her eyes filled with relief rather than excitement. She admitted she had spent years wondering whether anyone would ever take the board's conduct seriously. Watching investigators carefully follow documented evidence instead of rumors had restored her confidence that facts still mattered. I understood exactly what she meant. Throughout this entire experience, I had never hoped for anyone's downfall. I had simply hoped the truth would receive the same attention that false accusations had received months earlier. Before leaving, Eleanor smiled softly and looked toward the weathered ranch house. "Your grandfather always believed records protected honest people," she said. "Now I finally understand why he kept everything." After sunset, I walked alone to the old gate at the front of the ranch where the board had once stood, holding that envelope they believed could erase more than a century of family ownership. The cold air carried the scent of pine and clean snow, while distant lights from the subdivision glowed beneath the dark Montana sky. The gate looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything surrounding it had changed. Months earlier, the Homeowners Association believed they could remove me simply by declaring authority they never possessed. Now the same system of law they had tried to imitate was carefully examining every decision they had made. Standing there beneath the quiet stars, I realized justice had never arrived with dramatic speeches or raised voices. It had arrived one verified document, one truthful witness, and one patient decision at a time. Nearly a year has passed since that cold morning when a homeowners association board stood at my front gate believing a stack of official-looking papers could erase more than 100 years of family ownership. The ranch has returned to the quiet rhythm I always loved. Every sunrise still paints the eastern pasture with golden light. The cattle still gather near the same watering trough my grandfather installed decades ago. The scent of fresh hay, cedar fences, and mountain air still drifts across the valley exactly as it did long before any subdivision appeared beyond the southern hills. Yet one important difference remains. The homeowners association that once claimed authority over land it never governed no longer exists in the form it once did. Following the completed legal process, county officials announced that multiple findings involving board operations required formal corrective action. Several former board members faced legal proceedings connected to the documented conduct uncovered during the investigation, including the actions that had become the focus of months of careful review. A court-appointed administrator assumed temporary oversight while residents voted to dissolve the existing association and establish an entirely new neighborhood organization built upon transparent bylaws, independent financial oversight, and clearly defined legal boundaries. When the final public notice appeared, I quietly folded a copy into the same leather portfolio that already held my family's deeds and surveys. It belonged there because it had become part of the ranch's history. A few weeks later, I crossed paths with Linda for the first time since everything concluded. She was leaving the county courthouse as I arrived to record an updated survey related to one of my pasture improvements. We exchanged a brief greeting. Neither of us spoke about the investigation. There was nothing left to argue. The documents had already spoken with greater clarity than either of us ever could. She simply nodded, wished me well, and walked toward the parking lot. Watching her leave, I realized resentment had quietly disappeared somewhere along the journey. Carrying anger would never improve the ranch, repair a fence, or preserve my family's legacy. Truth had already accomplished what anger never could. Today, the old ranch office still looks exactly the way my grandfather left it. The cedar shelves remain filled with journals, survey maps, tax records, handwritten maintenance notes, and neatly labeled folders documenting every important decision made across 4 generations. Whenever I add another file, I think about the lesson he repeated throughout my childhood. Take care of the land, and take care of the records. Someday someone will need both. He was right. The records protected the land because they protected the truth. Every visitor who now drives through the valley sees only a peaceful ranch surrounded by open fields beneath the Montana sky. They never see the months of uncertainty, the endless paperwork, or the quiet patience that preserved it all. That is exactly how I prefer it. Justice does not always arrive with dramatic moments that last forever. Sometimes it arrives quietly, one verified fact at a time, until the people pretending to hold authority discover that real authority has belonged to the truth all along. Standing on my front porch as another sunset settles across the pasture, I finally understand that my family did not merely pass down 1,200 acres of land. They passed down the responsibility to protect what is right without ever forgetting that patience, honesty, and carefully preserved facts will always outlast borrowed power.